Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth part in this IPF Fatih policy series featuring Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen of the USIP, where she's the director of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program. Lucy is not only a highly sought-after voice on these issues, but she's a close friend of Israel Policy Forum and IPF Fatih, and we're so grateful and fortunate to be joined today. This educational series, which started earlier this spring, aims to educate new and existing IPF Fatih steering committee members about IPF's policies and approaches in the many arenas surrounding the two-state solution. We see this program as part of our commitment to you as leaders in providing high-quality education and access. As some of you may recall, Israel Policy Forum had to postpone our plans for our first ever steering committee fly-in to Washington, D.C. It is still in our immediate term vision to plan for this invite-only experience the moment we're able to convene in person again safely. You can see our past conversations in this series on our special webpage. As such, today's discussion will be recorded and internally circulated, but not published to the public. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen. Our two focal points today will be, firstly, IPF's policy approach toward Gaza as it relates to the two-state solution and Israel Policy Forum's positioning as an American policy organization. And secondly, contemporary insights and analysis of where things stand today, including how dynamics may have shifted since the 2018 Center for a New American Security report that we'll soon hear more about. I'll now turn it over to Lucy, and then I'll ask a couple questions and we can open it up for questions.
Sure, thank you, Dahlia. And really, I have a PowerPoint here which will just help me keep some of my thoughts and notes in order, but please, we're a small group. Even as we get larger, this is clearly a very informal conversation. So feel free to interject, ask me questions along the way, stop me at any time. You won't throw me off course, and we'll cover as much as you we're able to, and hopefully the things that are of most interest to you. Let me just give a couple of brief words up top. I don't know how familiar you are with U.S. Institute of Peace, which is the organization I work at, but just to situate that for you. So I direct our Israeli-Palestinian conflict program there. I've been there about 10 and a half years now working on this issue. USIP is a national, nonpartisan, independent, congressionally founded and funded organization. We were founded back in the 1980s by congressional authorization. We have a bipartisan Senate-confirmed board. And our mission and mandate is to work on international violent conflict. We basically hold by the mission that a world without violent conflict is possible, is practical. Doesn't mean it's easy to achieve, but it's also essential for US and broader international security. And we try to approach that mandate by working what we always talk about as top down and bottom up, which is we work with governments, we work with civil society organizations, building local capacities wherever we work around the world to manage or prevent or resolve violent conflicts non-violently. And so we do that through various streams of work. We're linking policy analysis, training, direct action, research, and grant giving as well. So that's just a sense of how we operate in this space. And it's really a pleasure to be speaking to you today and being part of this IPF ecosystem of conversations and the wonderful work that you all do on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was given the unenviable task of addressing Gaza, and the title here on my slide is taken from the CNAS report that Dahlia mentioned. CNAS and Brookings had a task force. They published their report back in 2018, I believe. I was a member of that task force, and the title referred to Gaza's perpetual crisis. And as we'll see as we go through this conversation, it's sadly a very apt term for it. It's obviously a vital one to talk about, particularly when we're talking about still trying to reach, as IPF promotes, a two-state solution. I say it's vital we talk about it, but the reality is that so many policy conversations and so much of the policy approach over so many years has actually tended to sideline Gaza, and not through lack of awareness that it's important. I think I put it down much more to a despair and sense of paralysis in some sense, that it is such a Gordian knot to untie for many of the reasons that we can go into, that sort of the charitable explanation, I think actually the accurate explanation is that the policy community writ large has decided that possibly trying to address what seemed at times like the more manageable aspects of this conflict may open up some opportunities and build some momentum that would then enable some progress to be made on Gaza. We haven't seen that yet, and again, something we can get into as we talk about current dynamics. Because of this, there's what I call a little bit of a Groundhog Day phenomenon to conversations around Gaza. I feel that for minimally the last 5 years, and that's generous, I think even more, we all keep having the same conversations about Gaza. There's a very known problem set. It just seems to have insurmountable complexity. The solutions on some level are clear. We know that there is, I've sort of broken it down to what I call 4 pillars of the crisis here. It oversimplifies it, but there's a economic component to it, humanitarian, which I would also combine here with a massive infrastructure crisis that contributes to that. What I'm terming kinetic here, I'm just referring to the perpetual cycle of violent flare-ups we've seen over many years between Israel and Hamas and some other factions in Gaza. And then of course the frozen, maybe some movement happening right now, again we can talk about that, the political crisis, the ongoing division between Fatah and Hamas. This, I'm not going to go through all of this. It's a very packed slide and sort of by design a packed slide just to give us a sense. This is just what I'm calling the kinetic timeline. The map over here is an OSHA map, a UN OSHA map, just to situate us here. This list, again, it's densely packed, but this is just since January 2006, which really is when we can date back the division into the 2 Palestinian polities. This is when Hamas wins the parliamentary elections in 2006. That catalyzed the struggle between Hamas and Fatah. In June 2007, after an incredibly bloody battle, Hamas managed to kick Fatah out of Gaza. And from then on, you've had this split Palestinian polity situation that you're well aware of with the PA, Fatah-dominated PA controlling the West Bank and Hamas in control of Gaza. Since then, again, you can just kind of scan down this timeline. These are when I talk about kinetic flare-ups and cycles of escalation and de-escalation. This has been ongoing with obviously numerous fatalities, mortalities, and as recently as August, where we've seen some significant flare-ups again. And we'll talk about sort of the context in which those are happening now. This is another attempt at a slide that's packed more just for effect with when we talk about, is it going to be so hard? How do we get to reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas? Since 2007, these are the, broadly speaking, there are different details that can be attached to each of these different attempts of the 2 factions to come to some kind of agreement. As you can see, it's almost annual, 2007, 8, 10, 11, 12, 2012 again, 13, 14, 16, 17, and we've just had a recent attempt in the last few days in Istanbul. So again, these 2 slides just trying to point out how intransigent, when I talk about this Gordian knot and why policy conversations have tended to wrestle with, but then move away from directly dealing or certainly effectively with Gaza, this is the complexity that we've been looking at. The challenges are—
Question?
Sure,
so what do those look like, at least in the more recent times, when you're talking about these reconciliation efforts? At what level are these talks? It seems like they're more than just back channels. Who's being sent to Istanbul? Like that level, like what do these look like? Sure. And I know that we're going back in 2007, but maybe in the last just couple of years, what have they been looking like?
Absolutely. So to back up broadly again, often these have been precipitated by outside variables or things happening in the broad Israeli-Palestinian context. So if we look at the Istanbul talks the last few days, those have very definitively grown out of the recent Israel-UAE boundary normalization agreements. The Palestinians feeling very under siege, I would say, by those. It's probably mean the Gazans are literally have been feeling under siege, but in terms of that development, the PA is feeling very weakened. It's the one rare piece of common ground Fatah and Hamas have been able to find with each other, is opposition to what is happening on that front. So that is really what catalyzed these talks. And you know, we can maybe get a little bit more detail into this later, but what you also see with them going to Istanbul here, you're starting to see a lot of the regional rivalries at play. Because what you see is Turkey trying to grab a mantle that, if you look at some of these other talks, Egypt has historically played, Qatar to some extent. There's been this sort of grouping of actors who have tried to play a constructive mediating role in the reconciliation process between Fatah and Hamas, and typically that's a role that Egypt has seen for itself as being the dominant actor, to the extent actually that these talks, they happened at the very end of September in Istanbul. They supposedly came to an agreement. You asked me who, so it's senior leadership from both factions. Al-Awari from Hamas and Jibril Rajoub, the PA, was there. They supposedly, or they did come to some agreement that was to lead to elections happening in the next 6 months, starting with Palestinian legislative elections to be followed by presidential elections. This is, of course, elections have not been held since 2006. And this is, again, has been a long sought after goal, promised more than once in the past. It's never quite materialized, but to give you a sense of where the regional rivalries come into play, since the Istanbul agreement, it was September 24th or possibly 27th, was the last days of September, within a few days, there is supposed to have been a presidential decree by Abbas authorizing election to go forward. It has not happened, and there has been reporting that some of the obstacle there is that Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, and Jordan are very opposed to this reconciliation process, primarily because Turkey has been shepherding it. And so there's a fair amount of pushback that's happening from these 4 other Arab countries on these new efforts. Abbas has actually said they felt that they're on the defensive now, saying, oh, it wasn't, we were in Turkey having these talks, but this isn't a Turkish-led process. They're trying to kind of smooth things over here. So just to give you a sense, when I say how complex this is, so many of these efforts get sidetracked by, it's more than just the 2 parties themselves who are operating here. There's a number of patrons and stakeholders that tend to either facilitate or get in the way a number of times. Does that start to answer?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the reason this has been complicated, when everybody's very clear, frankly, on what the challenges are, is that addressing some of these challenges, they're interrelated, and they can cause, addressing one challenge can exacerbate another. So what do I mean by that? For example, if you want to address head-on the economic and humanitarian situation in Gaza, a lot of parties have shied away from doing what they maximally might be able to do there for fear of empowering Hamas. If you empower Hamas too much by taking the pressure off them, because the Gazan people aren't thrilled with their Hamas leadership, they would like to see an improvement in conditions, and they don't just place the blame on Israel for that, they do place it on their ruling authorities as well. Certain actors are loath, including the PA, have been loath to take some of the pressure off Hamas and make Hamas look good in this situation. So there's been some caution often over the years around being seen to be giving too much to Hamas in trying to address these economic humanitarian concerns. There's also a challenge that, as I just mentioned, there are multiple stakeholders here with multiple interests and all who have a role to play. This is not a situation that can be tackled by just one actor, but there are so many divergent interests at play here that trying to get everybody to coordinate effectively is an impossible task, and that's why you've ended up with an impasse. I'm going to talk about the CNAS report here. We've got relevant policy exercises. I've been asked to speak about the CNAS Brookings Task Force report. Around the same time, while the task force was happening, we at USIP, along with in partnership with the Atlantic Council, actually did a Gaza crisis simulation that, believe it or not, focused on an infectious disease outbreak in the Gaza Strip. It was a fictionalized situation that was built around something that we thought could happen at that point. We were actually focused on cholera. We used cholera as the simulation scenario and looked at what might happen. We were trying to test the capabilities of different stakeholders to act alone and multilaterally to stem that kind of crisis and to address then a broader set of challenges. So we came away with some interesting findings from that have proven quite relevant, and that were also echoed very much by the CNAS Brookings Task Force analysis. To the CNAS report, so they identified two key, they were looking of course at this from the angle of what should be US policy objectives, specifically when it comes to Gaza. And they identified two key policy objectives: stabilize Gaza, address the humanitarian and economic crisis, and pursue political and physical reintegration of Gaza and the West Bank in a manner that promotes a two-state solution. I'm not highlighting these just ad hoc to make it look more colorful, but this is the two-state solution component there was key for the context of the recommendation. These aren't new objectives. These weren't new objectives. They mirror objectives the US had for a while, but the focus then became more on, but how do you address these with a new strategy? How do you address both of these simultaneously, or at least with effective constructive sequencing so that they can both be achieved? Again, where they came down is it needs to be done with close consultation. This cannot be one actor alone. It cannot be the US acting alone, although the US will need to take a prominent leadership and coordinating role. And the last part would be to plan for contingencies, i.e., earlier, you can't rule out the fact that you might yet have another military escalation at some point, and plan enough to be able to deal with that effectively, and if it does break out, to shorten it as much as possible. The caution that the task force came up with, or that's reflected in the report, was that while shifting away from a West Bank first policy, which had been the policy for a long time, you don't want to tip the pendulum too much in the other direction. If you swing too much in the direction of Gaza only focus, you're disempowering the PA and empowering, obviously by extension, Hamas, which would scuttle the chance of any deal between the Israelis and Palestinians. Their prescription, before the US can effectively promote Gaza crisis resolution, it has to credibly recommit to pursuing a two-state solution, restore US funds to UNRWA, amend the breach of the PA. This was actually in the context of a list of items that the conclusion of the report came up with, that there'd have to be some rebalancing or readjustment of US policy as it had been going in the months preceding in order to do this effectively. So I would just one last slide on some additional findings from our own simulation that I mentioned that complement this task force report. What we found very interesting, and this applies in the current context with the COVID crisis now raging, when we played out this simulation scenario, again, it was a cholera outbreak in our exercise. So the good news was that violent spoilers, the traditional violent spoilers, tended to stay in check while the crisis was in full force. While the crisis unfolded, they sort of stood back and allowed what needed to be done to mitigate the crisis to be done. What we also found is at the very beginning of the outbreak of a crisis, like a public health disaster, all the actors involved, actually, they aligned their interests were aligned enough to avert a full-scale crisis that they worked together very effectively to get that crisis under control. Again, in the non-real world simulation and also with cholera, this proved a lot easier than this real world situation of COVID. But as soon as the immediate crisis was over, the stakeholder interests began to diverge immediately in terms of how they wanted to address this long-term and long-term solutions. Everybody moved back to buying time. So in other words, once the initial crisis was averted, the pressure to act or concede on any independent interests that these different actors had completely declined. And what we learned and what we keep seeing playing out time and time again in the real world in Gaza is that a contained Gaza remained the most comfortable status quo for all actors, except of course for Gazans themselves who are living the day-to-day reality. Are there any questions in the meantime while I just go through the last couple of slides? Again, if people want to interrupt, if anything's not clear, feel free. So current status, if we take those recommendations from the CNAS report and those findings, how do they fit 2 years on at this point with what we're seeing currently? Do we see any new dynamics at play that render those conclusions irrelevant, that offer some new opportunities? Again, I won't go through all the bullet points here, you can glance them yourselves, but needless to say, going through these 4 pillars, the economic crisis that has been ongoing in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories generally has only been understandably exacerbated by COVID. Employment, movement, access, all those things that will have had a massive impact on economies everywhere, took what was already a pretty dire situation and has made it worse. The figures I saw that in the second quarter of 2020, unemployment in Gaza, this is Gaza alone, not Palestinian territories as a whole, is over 49%. And I've actually seen it listed a little bit higher than that as well. 80% of Gaza's population already is reliant on foreign assistance. And that was the case before COVID. This is at a time when donor support to the Palestinian economy is the lowest it's been in over a decade. And then you add to that some of these factors, which I'm sure you already know about, given when the prospect of annexation came up, the Palestinian Authority said it was no longer going to accept the tax revenues it gets from Israel. Again, if none of this is clear or you want clarification, I can explain further. But those revenues, which this arrangement has been in place since the Oslo Accords through an annex of the Oslo Accords called the Paris Protocol that governs economic and trade relations between the two sides. Those revenues that have been coming to the PA on a monthly basis, when the Palestinians refused to accept them, those total 60% of the PA's total revenues. And with those, the first things to go with that massive decline in revenue has been the PA's ability to pay salaries. And the PA does pay the salaries of PA employees who still are in Gaza. Most of them have not been working, but still getting paid because they've not been working because of this situation of Hamas being in charge, but they've still been receiving salaries, which of course contributes to the economy. That is the capacity of the PA to pay those has severely declined with this ongoing refusal to accept the tax revenues. Humanitarian situation, pre-COVID was already a baseline dire situation. And then you add to this fairly surprisingly well, or some will say not so surprisingly given how blockaded off it is, but Gaza had been doing fairly well at the outset of the COVID crisis, keeping its numbers low, but that unfortunately has not held. And there's been a 84% rise in cases in September alone in Gaza. This is in a situation where you already had a chronic shortage of hospital supplies, beds, specialized practitioners, ventilators. Qatar, some of you may know, has been playing a vital role in coordination and with cooperation from Israel of bringing money into Gaza. Because of the pandemic, there have been a couple of months where Qatar wasn't coming in with the money. They literally come in, there's an envoy, El Amadi, who comes in person with suitcases of money that had been stopped for a couple of months because of the pandemic. There was just that picked up again. But I added this last bullet, which seems a little maybe out of nowhere or out of keeping with the rest of the bullets here, but just to give a sense of the dire sort of public health and crisis situation in Gaza, there's been a lot written recently of a significant surge in suicide rates in Gaza. So the mental health situation is severe. Kinetic, again, this is referring to the flare-ups between Israel and Hamas. Again, you've seen a cycle over many years. Israel and Hamas have seemed to have come to something of a tacit agreement. There was sort of an unspoken ceasefire or an informal kind of ceasefire arrangement that had been in place since 2018, where there'd been almost this tacit cooperation. This is one of the ironies here. The US won't deal with Hamas. Israel effectively does deal with Hamas because it has to deal with Hamas because Hamas is the authority in Gaza. So again, they've been dealing with it by allowing Qatar in to come bring aid. But when you see these sort of cycles of escalation, at this point, I saw a very interesting, there was a recent ICG, International Crisis Group report on COVID in Gaza, but it had this phrase that stood out to me, which is what's happening now is that they're replacing this arrangement almost of calm for calm, whereas, you know, they'll both up the ante, neither side wants a full-blown war, but they will put pressure on each other enough to force concessions in some way, and it becomes a bit of a game of chicken. There had been this sort of understanding by many analysts that what was happening here is they were both fighting that if you stop firing rockets, we'll leave you alone too, right? If you in Gaza, Hamas stop firing rockets, we'll leave you alone too. What ICG's report suggested is that Hamas is now playing a game of calm for access. We need you to ease up on the blockade. It's sort of almost a lowering the bar of, we're not even trying to fight for ending the blockade anymore. We just need an easing of conditions. And so we will try to put pressure on you that way by every so often firing off some rockets and upping the ante, of course. Then Israel tries to affect its own deterrence in the other direction. And what you saw in August when this flared up again is that Israel responded actually by tightening the blockade. Fuel wasn't coming in and Gaza was down to about 4 hours of electricity a day for a certain time. That now again has been, with mediation, has been eased up on. But this is the kind of cycle you're seeing. Finally, political, and we just talked about this up front, the recent talks in Istanbul, and I mentioned this is now where you're seeing the regional rivalries play out. So finally, and then I'll open to your questions, this is one of the tables that they had in the CNAS report, which I found very, very useful, is they came to the conclusion, they said that basically you need a coordinated role with the key players being the US, the UN, with the Special Coordinator's Office, the UNSCO. I don't know if you've ever had the chance with IPFRT to hear from Nikolai Mladenov, who's the current UN Special Coordinator. He's played a phenomenally instrumental and effective mediating role over many years in this situation. But what the CNAS Brookings report basically identified Egypt, UNSCO, and the US as the three key actors. And that's actually what played out in our simulation as well. But then in this table and report, it goes through what would be the different coordinated roles of all the key actors. And what I've chosen the highlighting here is mine, because what I'm highlighting here are things that are interesting for us to think about in today's context and how applicable they still are. So the US would need to play the role of international coordinator. It would need to take steps in the West Bank that strengthen the PA and show its seriousness about a two-state solution, and reestablish some influence and leverage with the PA. These are things that the current administration doesn't seem well placed to do right now. You know, we're coming up on a US election. Might a second term of Trump, if that's what we end up looking at, decide to change course in this direction? And if we're looking at a Biden administration, would they be more inclined? And I think the answer to that one is a definitively yes, they'd be more inclined to try and reestablish some influence and leverage with the PA. But I think what you're seeing with our elections coming up, there is a bit of a paralysis, particularly among the Palestinian leadership. But all actors in the region, I think, are taking a little bit of they're holding their breath a little bit and waiting to see what the results of the election are before deciding what strategies to move forward on. I think that's why you're seeing right now some lack of clarity or definitive bold movements by many actors as they just wait to see what's going to play out, because it will have an impact. Egypt should continue to play the role of mediator between the PA and Hamas. Again, this goes back to what I just mentioned with them being none too happy that Turkey just seemed to be trying to step in there and usurp that role. UN, again, they've played an instrumental role and probably will continue to, but the idea is that all three of these actors, Egypt, UN, and US, should be instrumental and active in coordinating both on the economic and humanitarian front at the same time as they're seeking some kind of political agreement. Saudi and the UAE, again, incentivize Israeli and PA cooperation and agreement by offering openings to Israel and financial aid to the PA. Well, we've definitely seen in the last couple of months a chance for these Arab actors to have more influence and leverage on Israel if they choose to in this regard. Their relationships, perhaps ironically, but in the context of this, their relationships aren't as, they certainly still have leverage. They definitely have tensions between these countries and the Palestinians right now. So how they choose to exercise that leverage is, I think, one of the big questions we have. Qatar does continue to play an interesting donor role. And the interesting about Qatar in this mix, I would just flag, is that Qatar is not jumping ahead, as far as we can see right now, to normalize relations with Israel. But Qatar has been dealing with Israel without doing that quite openly in some ways in terms of how it is engaging on Gaza. Europe, one of the recommendations again in the report was that it could incentivize PA cooperation, because there is much PA cooperation needed here to come to an agreement and a solution on Gaza, because primarily it would require the PA to go back and assume security control in Gaza, which it's been unwilling to do. But the suggestion is, could the Europeans offer the Palestinians incentive by way of greater recognition? And you know, the question, I think, is that this is another holding their breath moment, I think, to see what plays out with the US election. But depending on what might happen, I think we are yet to see what steps Europe might take when it comes to trying to push forward on Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy and anything it might see that it thinks pushes back against the prospect of a two-state solution. Jordan, it still has a relationship with the PA and Israel. It still has that role to play. Turkey, that's just the last actor here listed. Turkey is gunning for as significant a role as possible in the region in this mix. And again, we see that in terms of it hosting these recent reconciliation talks. And I think Turkey sees a particular opportunity to play this role as these normalization agreements between Arab states and Israel play out, because Turkey now sees itself as holding the line in an informal axis, but certainly aligned with Iran in that sense, and in some ways with Qatar, and holding down almost a line of resistance against those kind of moves. So I've been talking a lot. I will stop there. I've thrown out a lot of different elements, and I'm happy to take your questions on any or all of these, or anything that I haven't raised. And I'm just going to close my door. One of my kids open, so 1 second.
Hi, Lucy. This is Robbie Kaufman in San Francisco. Sorry, I joined a little late. I had a conflict at the beginning, but I caught the second half of your remarks, and thank you. Very informative and thoughtful. Thank you. So the question I had is, I mean, you talked about it a bit at the end about kind of, you know, next steps and what different parties can do to kind of, you know, sort of affect or change the situation in Gaza. My question is, I mean, it sounds like essentially what we described and what folks potentially could do in the short term will not really shake up the status quo. It doesn't sound like, you know, the folks, you know, Hamas who's you know got control of Gaza is really, you know, incentivized, motivated to make, you know, sort of meaningful change to change sort of the situation in Gaza. So I guess my question is, you know, is there anything in particular that either that you discussed or that you didn't discuss that really you think could be a game changer, something that will actually, you know, change the situation on the ground, will, you know, lead you know, will lead Hamas to, you know, put down its weapons, will enable Israel to be comfortable with, you know, additional, you know, less restrictions on Gaza. From my perspective, it just sounds like whatever's happening and whatever has been suggested will change things on the margin, but not really make, you know, meaningful, lasting change.
I mean, I think that's I think that's exactly right. It's actually, before I got on this call, I had a meeting with some of my team at USAP, and I was just saying, boy, I feel so bad. I'm going into, a talk on Gaza, and you sort of want to, whenever you're giving a talk on any of these issues, you want to be offering, be like, okay, so here are some opportunities, and here are some next steps, and here are some positive things. I said, I feel like I'm scraping the barrel here. I mean, it is a dire and bleak situation. I think you are right that right now you have a constellation of actors, for many of the reasons I painted, who don't have much motivation to make big, bold moves. And I include Hamas in that. Obviously Gaza is suffering, and Hamas would like to see an easing of the blockade and an improvement of economic humanitarian situation. But they don't have the incentive to do the things that they would need to do in terms of international requirements to see meaningful move forward. They're not willing to give up their weapons. We haven't seen any interest in that, and that's the condition the international community has been putting. It's the condition that the PA has been putting on coming back into Gaza. They're not willing to go back into Gaza and not have, again, this term one authority, one gun. And of course, this has significant implications. I didn't talk about this, and this was something I know that you all did want to talk about. Part of the challenge when we talk about, are we still aiming towards a two-state solution? The challenge that's always been raised, this is the catch-22, is, well, how do we have a two-state solution with a divided Gaza? You can't have these two separate polities. The Palestinians need to get their house in order to then move towards a single unitary state. But of course, the conditions under any time Hamas and Fatah have tried to move towards a reconciliation deal, there's been a lot of opposition, particularly from Israel and the US, because Hamas is in charge. He's still identified by many of these actors as a terrorist organization, refuses to give up its arms. And so it really is the actors are stuck. In terms of other opportunities, look, I showed you very deliberately, you might not have been on for this one, the slide that showed you the long line of attempts at different reconciliation talks would be enough to make any of us cynical that this new one, why should this new one be any different? The only thing I'd say there is I have learned, particularly over the last number of months on so many issues, to never assume or bet on anything in this conflict. And very specifically, when the Palestinians said back in May, I believe, that's it, we're not going to accept the tax revenues, we're going to cut off security cooperation because Israel's talking about annexation. A number of us, I wasn't alone in this, a number of us all rolled their eyes, said, oh, there we go again, you keep saying you're going to cut off security cooperation, but they never do it. And they actually did it, and they're still holding. So again, there are breaking points some of these actors have. And so the fact that you've had this long line of reconciliation talks and talks about, shall we move to Palestinian elections, that have never taken off yet, doesn't mean that with the change dynamics going on, something couldn't happen. The other thing to look for always, and this I know seems like almost like the cop-out, looking for like the Deus Ex Machina, leadership changes on either side, right? I mean, people have been saying for years, how much longer can Abbas last? He's old, he's not in good health. He seems to have been holding out, but at some point there will be a change in Palestinian leadership. Certainly in the West Bank coming soon. And Israeli politics has shown itself, we haven't had much change in Israeli politics for a while in terms of who ends up as leader, but we've certainly seen a tumultuous political cycle, and that doesn't seem to be getting any less tumultuous. So you never know what opportunities come with a change in the constellation of leadership. And again, I keep backing back to that includes also where our own elections end up, right? If you end up with we could end up with some all of a sudden new constellation of leaders in a number of these stakeholder places that end up unlocking different opportunities. So I know, again, this sounds like grabbing at the what ifs and fanciful hypotheticals, but we're really at a stage where we can't rule anything out. And particularly the last thing I'd say is this new game changer, and it is a game changer. We're yet to see to what extent and on which particular issues, but there is definitely something game changing about these agreements we're seeing between Israel and, for now, up until now, Bahrain and the UAE. If those actors choose to, there is leverage they now have both on the Israelis and the Palestinians that they could bring to bear if they had the political will to do so, if they wanted to take some bold moves in that direction. Those calculations for them might very much depend on who's in the leadership here in the United States, who ends up in leadership in Israel if there's another election. So again, it's almost like this multifaceted, multidimensional chessboard where there's a lot of waiting going on, but if some of those things all rearrange at once, you can't rule out some opportunities for some bold moves.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry if you answered this earlier. I also had a conflict. My name is Ellenbogen. I'm from the DC chapter, but I was wondering how Hamas is dealing with COVID relative to the PA. I asked because quite a few other like non-state actors, I'm thinking of particularly Al-Shabaab and HTS in Idlib, have both been doing very well and using it as a bit of a propaganda tool to see, look how your secular governments have failed you, right, and what we can do. And so I'm wondering how the relative responses to COVID will impact negotiations.
Sure. No, it's a great question. I touched on COVID a little bit, not specifically that question. What I had mentioned is that actually at the beginning, whether through, I mean, it was strong Hamas management of the situation, and also the fact that, you know, Gaza had the, quotes, advantage of being so contained in many ways that it did hold off at the beginning when cases were rising in Israel and in the West Bank. It really was very slow to develop cases, and they were very good and able as the cases that they did see. I think in March and April, around April, there were maybe 9, and then they went up to about 13 cases, all of which were coming in their quarters. They were coming in at the border from Egypt, quarantined them there at the border, and they kept it very much under check. That's not been the case. What I mentioned at the beginning, in September, there's been about an 80, or I think it was maybe 84% rise in COVID cases in Gaza. So it is a very worrying situation. The authorities, you know, they're good at restrictions and they're good at clamping down. So they have been, I think they're doing as good a job as they can on containing it as much as they can, seems to be the perception. In terms of your question, where you framed it relative to, you know, does it get points for that almost, and that's not quite how you framed it, relative to how the PA is handling. The PA has largely been seen to have been handling it very well as well. It actually got in polling, you know, if you follow regular Palestinian polls, and there is one in particular, Khalil Shakaki polls very regularly, you'll have seen over the last number of years, the Palestinians in the West Bank overwhelmingly do not support their leadership on any number of issues. But the one outlier on this over the last number of months, there was a feeling, there was great approval of how their leadership had been handling the COVID crisis. So again, it's not really I would say, yes, Hamas, I think, is seen to be handling it about as well as they could. It's not being seen as in comparison to the PA. They're both seemingly managing this curveball effectively. The one challenge actually in the West Bank is now that the PA has cut off cooperation with Israel, that has seriously hampered its ability to handle it as effectively, because if you're not coordinating or cooperating with the Israeli authorities, really, it makes it much harder to have the effective coordinated response you need, particularly with things like workers going back and forth across borders, etc.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you also very much for this presentation. I'm Rachel Wallace. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm curious, you know, you mentioned a little bit about Abbas, and the guy's old, smokes, you know, several packs of cigarettes a day. Assuming his time does come to an end, I don't know if United States Institute of Peace has an official policy on who it would like to see take over his position. Is this something even that you can opine on? And if so, who are you rooting for? What's the recommendation?
Oh, well, look, we certainly don't have official policies on who should be, you know, leaders of any of the places or in other places. And in terms of the sort of broader question, or do I have an opinion on what this might look like? I think the challenge that all analysts of the situation are having is there are any number of contenders. There is not a clear succession path or line here. This is why elections are seen as important. And again, supposedly this agreement, if it can get legs, should lead, is designed to lead, has a vision, I would say, of a legislative elections happening, followed by presidential elections. The legislative would be happening according to the timeline of this agreement in Istanbul within 6 months. There are a number of contenders in the mix on the PA side, and I honestly, it's not being coy. It wouldn't even be about taking a position. If you even asked you to speculate, it's really, I really do believe it's anyone's guess right now. I mentioned that, you know, Jibril Rajoub was there leading the talks from the PA side in Istanbul. He's definitely someone that is mentioned as someone who could be a candidate for that. The challenge with elections is that if you look again, I go back to the polling, and this is definitely, I'm sure, on Fatah's mind, the current PA leadership and that close inner circle of PA leadership doesn't have a lot of support, and that's an understatement from the Palestinian public. So if you're open to true, free and fair elections, it's unclear how they would fare, and also unclear how they would fare, you know, pitted against Hamas at this point. So it really, it's not, and I think that's what some people find concerning. Now again, ideally, if you have elections, one shouldn't have to know. If you have democratic elections, anybody could rise to the top there. But this is where you're going to see there's various spheres of influence within the current inner circle. And there's no, I'd say there was no, there's no clear favorite right now that rises to the top.
Sort of as on top of the question that Rachel just asked, did the report or any analysis since look into if there is a sudden shift of power? Like, we know that Abbas is older. We're also going through a pandemic that is unfortunately affecting a lot of our older folks and populace. I can imagine that would probably create some tumult in the region. And how would Gaza, I mean, obviously there's a side of the West Bank, but I'm curious, like, how would that affect in Gaza specifically as the topic of the discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is always the concern, right? With a no clear path to elections, coupled with an unclear succession strategy or plan, coupled with this divided polity and divided leadership and the history of that. I think that's what, when those, you know, I said we did this crisis simulation, we chose to do ours around, you know, if there was an outbreak of a contagious or infectious disease in Gaza, but I would imagine that there was any number of kind of crisis simulations that have played out in various institutions on what happens in the kind of succession scenario, need for succession scenario you're talking about, the sort of an all of a sudden crisis where next steps haven't been established clearly. It is definitely, I think, a concern, and things something that is being watched. I would imagine, again, there is this, and in the West Bank, there is a close sort of PA inner circle, and I would imagine if this were sort of a sudden overnight thing, you would have some kind of, I mean, there technically is a line of succession there, but you could see that being overridden in favor of whoever was thought, and that might be already known among them and just not announced, was thought to be the one to be able to step in and secure stability. The one thing that we haven't mentioned here that you might be hearing come up in the context of the recent UAE-Israel deal, there's been a fair amount of speculation about Mohammed Dahlan. So Dahlan, Dahlan was very instrumental. Dahlan is in the UAE. And there's been some speculation that partly behind some of the UAE's calculations here has been an interest, they have denied it, but an interest in getting Dahlan into the leadership, into the Palestinian leadership position. He's been an interesting character. He was the enmity, and there is deep enmity between Dahlan and the PA that goes back to the Battle of Gaza in 2007 when Fatah was violently kicked out and Hamas took over. So the rivalries are intense. Dahlan has had this interesting ability to kind of be at odds with, but play with both sides over time, Fatah and Hamas. He doesn't poll particularly highly among Palestinians at all. But since this UAE deal with Israel, you've seen a lot of cracking down by the PA on people who are seen to be Dahlan supporters within the West Bank. A lot of rounding up and arrest recently of Dahlan supporters in the West Bank. Again, he's hanging out in the UAE. He's been very quiet, but a lot of people have been asking questions about whether some would say it rises to the level of conspiracy theory. Some would just say it's sound analysis of is this somewhere in the mix of UAEs and Israel's longer term considerations? Would they like to see Dahlan move into a leadership position? Because do they see him as someone that might play a more constructive role in some kind of eventual Israeli-Palestinian agreement?
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Sure, I don't know if there's enough time even to answer this, but I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about what the Gaza simulation looked like and how you facilitated that.
It was that sounds bad to say, it was a lot of fun. We were looking at Gaza and cholera and dire humanitarian conditions, but I had actually never done one before. We partnered, as I said, with the Atlantic Council, and they have someone who runs these, who has run a lot of different simulations. So he was really an incredible resource to us on how these things play out. So what we did, we actually were very fortunate. We got some wonderful people to play the different roles, people who former high-level diplomats, politicians who've been engaged in these various countries, think tanks. And we had teams. So you had, a team of 3 playing the US. And we didn't within that assign roles. We didn't say you're the US and you're President Trump and we just said you 3 are the US. You can define, your roles how you want. You 2 are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all the stakeholders. And in fact, those last couple of slides were that reference the different stakeholders that the CNAS Brookings report pointed to in terms of instrumental roles. All of those actors were represented. In addition to, we had people representing different factions. We had Hamas, we had a sort of group that was representing Palestinian Islamic Jihad and some of the other more extremist factions again. We had a Russia and an Iran to meddle every so often. And there was, what we did is we broke it down into, you had an opening scenario, and then they had an hour and a half to, here's your scenario. You've just found out that cholera has broken out in the Shati refugee camp, go, right? And they could decide, they were all in different rooms. So the US could then decide, okay, this is what we're gonna do, and we need to pass a message at this point to Egypt. So they go to Egypt's room and find Egypt or invite Egypt to come to their room, and they sort of play it out. And then after an hour and a half, we call time and we all assemble. And we say, okay, where did we all end up? What did you agree to? And then we take those findings and then we write the next stage scenario based on what happened. So you're kind of changing it in real time. You're like, oh, okay, Israel opened the ports and Egypt opened the borders, and so relief was able to get in. So now we've contained the crisis for now. Okay, but now what? Now Hamas wants to extract something. And so then you go back to round 2. And we did it over a day and a half. And then we sort of did that kind of pattern twice, where you kind of go, you play it out, you take stock of where you are, write a new scenario, and then you do a conclusions finding. So it's fun because some people get really actually into the roles in a very funny way. But what was interesting, I was fascinated by, because I wasn't sure how it would go, I had not seen before. It was actually really interesting to see how true to type people played the roles of their countries, that played their respective roles. And sort of sad and depressing, therefore, to see how it played out exactly as it does in real time, right? This finding was just glaring to us that, gosh, you all just cooperate until you do the bare minimum to stop the bleeding, as it were. And then we'll just, who can be bothered to go that extra mile? It's just not worth it. And so it was very enlightening in terms of, what actually plays out in these considerations.
has there been any validation? Sorry, last question, I swear.
Yeah.
Any validation on the sort of scenario, and then now with COVID as unlikely but similar, any specific validations of your analysis?
To some extent, actually, yes. I mean, in the, like at the beginning, for example, as I said, when COVID hit there in the West Bank, certainly, and then when you start to see those first few cases in Gaza, everybody is concerned enough about the implications that, you know, where aid and medical supplies needed to get in, they were allowed in. And you did see at the very beginning, and this played out in conflict zones around the world, not just in the Israeli-Palestinian context, you saw initial bursts and there was some kind of hope and optimism around it that like, oh gosh, it's like earthquake diplomacy, you know, this crisis happens and maybe it'll lead to some cooperation on other levels. It soon dissipated. And in fact, I should say what was a little bit different in the Gaza case, you actually saw some games being played fairly early on with Gaza and Israel, where Gaza was saying, we need some medical supplies and we need ventilators let in, and Israel, then they both saw it as opportunities to try and extract other things. So Israel said, okay, but you have 2 prisoners of ours and you have some bodies of soldiers of ours and we'd like those back in return. And the Gazans were, the Hamas was appealing to say, we just need this medical supply and they can't hold, you know, this condition for us, but they also were trying to extract, and that's when you started seeing, in August, you started seeing rockets firing again. So there has been some game playing too, and some trying to take advantage of the situation, which we didn't see in the sort of very potted, contracted version of our simulation we did with Color. We just saw the very early stages of, all right, let's do what we have to do to contain this crisis. So unfortunately, it doesn't take actors long to revert to the political calculations. But in terms of the thing that was very striking, as I said, and was also a conclusion of the CNAS Brookings report, and that does continue to play out, is what I would broadly call just a collective crisis, a collective action crisis. You need this handful of actors to all play their part responsibly in coordination with each other, and in some cases to put aside some divergent interests towards this common end if there's going to be progress made. And they just, at the end of the day, they just can't do it. Things get in the way. And again, to me, the prime example is this news story this morning of, shouldn't Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, Egypt on their face be celebrating the fact that the Palestinians are trying to come to some kind of agreement again, but they cannot stomach the fact that they don't trust Turkey. They cannot stomach the fact that Turkey is taking the lead on it. So any interest they might have for right now is being, you know, shunted aside for that consideration. So sadly, that is where we are seeing some of the, it's useful to know these simulation activities do have there is some validity to them if done right, but yeah, you do see some of these dynamics play out.
I can see why you described it as fun. I think we would all like to be a fly on the wall of those in that simulation. But as we get to the top of the hour, I'd love to thank you again, Lucy.
Of course,
as well
thank you.
Yeah, as well as the IPF FAT volunteer leaders tuning in right now and watching this recording. Your commitment to not only learning about these complex issues, but also in being active change agent toward advancing pragmatic policies and conversations like this is truly the beating heart of our work at IPF FAT. Next week, we look forward to announcing our next public program focused on the US presidential elections, like you mentioned, and how it intersects with many of our key subject areas looking at 2020 and beyond. Stay tuned for the next installment in this steering committee educational series, where we plan to continue connecting IPF FAT lay leaders with top Israel Policy Forum experts in the wider field of Middle East policy. Once again, thank you so much, Lucy, for your time. And
of course, thank you. And lovely to meet you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Such
you.
a privilege
Thank
to
you very
meet
much.
you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.